Again, in this lecture, we're going to pick up with talking about India. Indian colonization was more immediate and profound than African colonization, believe it or not. Europeans had laid claim to only small parts of Africa between 1750 to 1870, but nearly all of India, which had 3 times the population of Africa, came under Britain's direct or indirect rule. After the founding of the East India Company in 1600, it took British interests 250 years to commandeer the colonies and trade of the Dutch, fight off French and Indian challenges, and pick up the pieces of the decaying Mughal Empire. The might of the Mughal Empire had not lasted long after the reign of Aurangzeb, who died in 1707. In 1739, Iranian invaders sacked Delhi and carried off vast amounts of booty. Indian states also took advantage of Mughal weaknesses to assert their independence. By the mid-1700s, the Maratha Confederation, a coalition of states in central India, controlled more land than the Mughals did. Several Nawabs, or Muslim princes who served the Mughal emperor, carved out powerful states of their own. Ambitious young company men, employed by the British, French, and Dutch trading companies, used hard bargaining and hard fighting when necessary to persuade these Indian rulers to allow them to establish coastal trading ports. To protect their fortified warehouses, the companies hired trained Indian troops known as sepoys. In fragmented India, these private armies came to hold the balance of power. In 1691, the East India Company had persuaded the Nawab of Bengal in northeast India to allow a company trading post at the fishing port of Calcutta. In 1756, a new Nawab overran the post and imprisoned a group of East India Company men in a cell so small that many died of suffocation. To avenge their deaths in what they called the Black Hole of Calcutta, a large East India Company force from Madras overthrew the Nawab. The weak Mughal emperor was persuaded to acknowledge the East India Company's right to rule Bengal in 1765. By 1788, Calcutta had grown into a city of 250,000 people. Along with Calcutta and Madras, the third major center of British power was Mumbai, on the western coast. There, in 1818, the East India Company annexed large territories to found the core of what was called the Bombay Presidency. This gave the East India Company an empire with 50 times the population of the colonies the British had lost in North America. One goal of what they called the British Raj, the British rule of India, was to remake India on a British model through administrative measures, economic development, and modern technology. But the company men, like the Mughals before them, had to temper their interference with Indian social and religious customs lest they provoke rebellion or lose the support of their Indian princely allies. The main policy was to create a powerful and efficient system of government. Another policy was to substitute private property for India's complex and overlapping patterns of landholding. In Bengal, this reform worked to the advantage of large landholders, but in other places the peasantry gained. Private ownership made it easier for the state to collect taxes that were needed to pay for administration, the army, and economic reform. Such policies of westernization, anglicization, and modernization, as they have been called, were only one side of the British rule. The other was the bolstering of, quote, traditions, both real and newly invented. In the name of tradition, the Indian princes who ruled nearly half of British India were permitted to expand their power and splendor. The British rulers themselves invented many traditions, including elaborate parades and displays called durbars, that were half borrowed from European royal pomp, half from Mughal ceremonies. The British and Indian elites danced sometimes in close partnerships and sometimes in apparent opposition. But the ordinary people of India, women of every status, members of subordinate Hindu castes, the untouchables, and tribals outside of the caste system, and the poor generally, found less benefit from the British reforms and much new oppression from the taxes and traditions. The implementation of British rule in India and many other places criminalized homosexuality for the first time, and it's only been in recent years that India overthrew this colonial measure. The transformation of British India's economy was also double-edged. On the one hand, the growth of an internal and external trade created many new jobs, as did the expansion of farming. Opium in Bengal, largely for export to China, coffee in Ceylon, and tea in Assam in northeastern India. On the other hand, competition from cheap cotton goods produced in Britain's industrial mills drove many Indians out of the handicraft textile industry. In the 18th century, India had been the world's greatest exporter of cotton textiles. In the 19th century, India increasingly shipped raw cotton fiber to Britain. Economic changes, including beneficial ones, caused disruption. Thus, local rebellions by displaced ruling elites, disgruntled religious traditionalists, and the economically dispossessed were almost constant during the first half of the 19th century. The greatest concern was over the loyalty of Indian sepoys in the East India Company's army. In the early decades of the East India Company rule, most sepoys came from Bengal. The Bengali sepoys resented the recruitment of other ethnic groups into the army after 1848, such as the Sikhs from Punjab and the Gurkhas from Nepal. Many high-caste Hindus objected to a new law in 1856 requiring new recruits to be available for service overseas, for their religion prohibited oceanic travel. Then, in 1857, the replacement of the standard muskets by the more accurate Enfield rifles sparked outrage because they required soldiers to have to use their teeth to tear open the ammunition cartridges. Those ammunition cartridges were greased with animal fat. Fat from cattle offended Hindus, fat from pigs offended Muslims. A quick change in the cartridge opening process could not forestall a rebellion by Hindu sepoys in May 1857. Muslim sepoys, peasants, and discontented elites also joined in. The rebellion lasted 10 months before the British put it down, but it shook the empire to its core. Now, historians have attached different names and meanings to the events of 1857 and 1858. 19th century British historians labeled it the Sepoy Rebellion, or Sepoy Mutiny. Seeing these events as the beginning of later movements for independence, some modern Indian historians have termed it the Revolution of 1857. Regardless of label, the events of 1857 and 1858 marked a turning point in the history of modern India. In their wake, Indians gained new centralized government, entered a period of rapid economic growth, and began to develop a new national consciousness. In 1858, Britain eliminated the last traces of Mughal and East India Company rule. In their place, a new Secretary of State for India in London oversaw Indian policy, and a new Governor-General in Delhi acted as the British monarch's viceroy. In November 1858, Queen Victoria, who would assume the title of Empress of India in 1877, guaranteed all Indians equal protection of the law and the freedom to practice their religions and social customs. But she also assured the Indian princes that so long as they were loyal to the Queen, British India would respect their control of territories and, quote, their rights, dignity, and honor. Let's see how long that lasts. Meanwhile, a powerful and efficient bureaucracy controlled India. Members of the elite Indian civil service, mostly graduates of Oxford and Cambridge, held the senior administrative and judicial posts. Numbering only 1,000 at the end of the 19th century, they visited the villages in their districts, heard lawsuits and complaints, and passed judgments. A far greater number of Indian officials and employees served beneath them. Recruitment into the ICS was mostly by open examination, given only in England, and thus inaccessible to most Indians. In 1870, only one Indian was a member of the ICS. Subsequent reforms led to 57 Indian appointments by 1887, but there the process stalled. Beginning in the 1840s, a railroad boom gave India its first national transportation network, followed by telegraph lines, and by 1870, India had the fifth largest rail network in the world. The government invested millions of pounds sterling in other public works as well. Forests were felled to make way for tea plantations. Indian farmers were persuaded to grow cotton and jute for export. Engineers built great irrigation systems to alleviate the famines that periodically decimated whole provinces, and as a result, India's trade expanded rapidly. Most of the exports were agricultural commodities: cotton fiber, opium, tea, silk, and sugar. In return, India imported manufactured goods from Britain, including machine-made cotton textiles that undercut Indian handloom weavers. Some women found jobs at very low pay on plantations or in the growing cities where prostitution flourished. Everywhere in India, poverty remained the norm. Easier movement and urbanization promoted the spread of cholera, a disease transmitted through water contaminated by human feces. In 1867, officials demonstrated the close connection between cholera and pilgrims who bathed in and drank from sacred pools and rivers. The installation of a new sewerage system and a filtered water supply in Calcutta dramatically reduced cholera deaths there. Similar measures in Mumbai and Madras also led to great reductions, but most Indians lived in small villages where famine and lack of sanitation kept cholera deaths high. Both the successes and failures of British rule stimulated Indian nationalism. The failure of the rebellion of 1857 led some thoughtful Indians to argue that the only way to regain control of their destiny was to reduce their country's social and ethnic divisions. Individuals such as Rammohun Roy had promoted development along these lines a generation earlier. A Western-educated Bengali from a prominent family, Roy was a successful administrator for the EIC, the East India Company, and a student of comparative religion. His Brahmo Samaj, or Divine Society, founded in 1828, attracted Indians who sought to reconcile the values of the West with the religious traditions of India. They backed the British outlawing of sati, or widow burning, in 1829, and of slavery in 1834, and sought to correct other abuses of women and female infanticide. Roy and his followers advocated reforming the caste system and urged a return to the founding principles of the Upanishads, ancient sacred writings of Hinduism. Although Brahmo Samaj remained influential after the rebellion of 1857, many Indian intellectuals turned to Western secular values and nationalism as a way to reclaim India, often aided by European and American missionaries. In 1870, there were 790,000 Indians in over 24,000 elementary and secondary schools, and India's 3 universities, all established in 1857, awarded 345 degrees. Many new nationalists arose from the Indian middle class, and in 1885, nationalists convened the first Indian National Congress, which called for a greater Indian role in the civil service and for greater efforts to reduce poverty. But although the Indian National Congress promoted unity among the country's many religions and social groups, most early members were upper caste, Western-educated Hindus and Parsis. Until it attracted the support of the masses, it could not hope to challenge British rule. I hope this series of lectures has given a better sense of the ideas of colonialism, and looking at some of the more extreme examples gives us an idea of how the division between those industrialized and non-industrialized countries played out. And just know that at every stage, there's going to be resistance to that imperialist mindset. But remember, sometimes mere existence is resistance. All right, we're going to pick up again with colonialism and imperialism later on in the course, but this kind of gives us some foundations. All right, stay tuned for the next lecture.